You know what, 2017 sucked too. I mean, it was better than the last couple years, I'll give it that, but between the train wreck that was the Trump presidency, the scores of environmental disasters that happened, and the horrible terrorist attacks from Manchester to Vegas, 2017 just didn't justify its own existence. And as for me, my student loans are making sure that I do not have a week go by without some sort of anxiety attack about money, and I cannot get good lighting in this goddamn apartment if I try. I have tried everything, and I can't afford to get good lighting because fuck! And it also just wasn't the best year for movies. I mean, it wasn't the worst year, but it was definitely the weakest since 2013. And it's not because we had a lot of bad ones, we just had a lot of mediocre and okay ones.
From overrated schlock like A Ghost Story and Fate of the Furious, to huge disappointments like Book of Henry and Alien Covenant, to movies I barely even remember like Ghost in the Shell and Baywatch.
But you don't want to hear about the mediocre ones, you want to hear about the ones I fully can say I did not like. Well, before we get onto the actual list, here are some dishonorable mentions.
The Great Wall. I don't remember a frame of this. The Mummy, the most slow-paced, underwhelming summer blockbuster I've seen in a while. The Bye-Bye Man. I will admit that there are interesting ideas in this, it just doesn't execute a single one to its full potential. Rings. This would have been on the list, but I fell asleep, so I can't judge it fairly. Chips. It's an unfunny gross-out movie with a dumb plot and confusing direction. And finally, The Snowman. A colossally boring mess that just barely escapes the list because the movie we may have gotten had they finished it could have been decent.
Anyway, let's get into the real shit. We're counting down!
Look what you made me do.
The top 5 worst movies of 2017. Number 5. I legit did think the trailers for this movie looked okay. I mean, there was always the chance it could turn out terrible, and it did, but I was actually looking to give it a chance. Remember in my Haunting Hour I Don't Think About It review when I compared its premise to The Bye-Bye Man? Well, this movie also reminds me of an R.L. Stine project, the Goosebumps story, Be Careful What You Wish For. And yes, this premise was done much better in a children's book in the 90s. It's a really simple premise that should work. A girl gets a box that can make any of her wishes come true, so she uses it the way you would expect her to. Become popular, get the hot guy, get back at the alpha bitch, but with every wish she makes, someone close to her dies. Except for once when her friend's cousin she just met gets axed off. No one in this movie is likable, well except for Barb from Stranger Things playing the exact same character. Claire is selfish, her friend Meredith is a bitch, and everyone else is either stupid or just there to build up the body count. There's no good deaths in the movie, they're all either can only happen because the characters are idiots or are unintentionally hilarious.
Just imagine if a Three Stooges short ended with them dying. That's what this movie's like.
Seriously, they all feel like Final Destination deaths, but without the slightly comedic tone those movies had, or the build-up. And because of that, it could be pretty funny. I'm not normally one who laughs at bad horror films, I'm usually a bad animated and bad drama guy, but this one did get quite a few laughs out of me, especially the ending, which might be the funniest scene in any movie this year. You cannot convince me that wasn't meant to be comedic. And Joey King is pretty good as Claire. I mean, the character sucks, because after a while you just start screaming, "Stop wishing for things, you idiot!" But she pulls it off pretty well. I guess most people would say this isn't as bad as stuff like The Bye-Bye Man or The Snowman, but I didn't go into those movies with expectations. This actually had an idea. Unfortunately, they botched it up so bad that it ends up in a completely different genre.
Discovering something brand new. I'm in love with the shape of you. Look what you made me do. Look what you made me do. Look what you just made me do.
Number 4.
And we have a tie, which I haven't really done since like my very first list video. But yes, at number 4 we have 2 terrible animated films, one you've probably never heard of, and one you expected to be on the list.
Get him! Cue the milk and cookies, cue the milk and cookies.
And...
Come on, man, it's high five. You know me, I'm a favorite. Alex hasn't picked you in weeks, and if he stops picking you, you're no longer a favorite.
We'll start with Spark. I would not have watched this had my followers not picked this in a Twitter poll, but I went in hoping for something passable, and it was really annoying. The animation is unimpressive for a theatrically released film, no matter how small, but it's not terrible. In fact, it may actually make a good demo reel for some student just getting out of an art school, and if I had seen it as a demo reel, I would find it really impressive and would bring him onto a real movie with a budget and, you know, a plot. The story is complete trite. You can point to every plot point in this film and describe what movie they were ripping off. From Starship Troopers, to Minions, to Star Wars, to Lion King, to Treasure Planet, to Transformers, to The Terminator, but the movie I think it was trying to be the most was Ratchet and Clank.
In fact, I have a theory. You know how every animated film has some cheap knockoff? Well, I think this was originally supposed to be the ripoff of Ratchet and Clank, but after that movie bombed so terribly, they tried to distance themselves from it, and this is the result.
Most of the characters are just boring, but the main character and villain are so ungodly annoying that I genuinely wanted the movie to focus on the little bug sidekicks that were just there to rip off the minions. The kid who played Spark, who was also apparently Henry Danger, gives him the most generic kid voice, and the villain is both too cruel to be funny and too stupid to be taken seriously. A moment can't happen because they always have to put in some stupid joke, and it's almost never funny. The only character I chuckled at was Patrick Stewart. Speaking of which, let's move on to the other terrible animated movie with a minor character played by Patrick Stewart. The Emoji Movie was a film that, while I was actually watching it, I wasn't pissed off, but the more I think about it, the more infuriated I get. And it's not the product placement, I expected that. It's the fact that it's a terribly written film. The main character is such a failure, he sucks at doing the most simple task that I actually sided with the villain because she was right in that if Alex thinks the phone is broken, it would kill them all. Speaking of Alex, he's barely in this. And yeah, it rips off several other movies like Inside Out, Wreck-It Ralph, and the Lego Movie. Nothing about this world makes sense. They have internet trolls in an app, and emojis can apparently both go to the bathroom and reproduce despite not having genitals. It's never really funny. I only laughed a couple of times, and one of them was at a cat video. And it's just no fun. There's a scene with them running through hallways between apps, and instead of going through the apps, having an action scene through all these different worlds, they just run through the long hallways. And while the animation itself is pretty good, the character designs and background work are really uninspired. It looked like a better animated version of Dorby's.
But I could have forgiven all of that. My main reason for hating this movie is one character. High Five.
This character is a complete fail. He isn't funny, he isn't charming, he does all of two things to help Gene and Jailbreak, and every other time he is either an asshole or actively making their journey harder. And there's more wrong with it, but others go into more detail than I can, although I do have one disagreement with what some people are saying.
And millennials.
No, this is not pandering to millennials. This was made for kids, and kids are Gen Z. And that's why I find it more insulting than if it were made for teenagers. These two movies pissed me off so much because they were trying to appeal to kids. But as one of my show's titles will say, kids are smarter than this. We don't have to give them shit. So which one was worse? Well, Spark was more annoying and looked worse, but it did at least have a little bit of heart to it. While Emoji Movie just feels like it was made to make money and was also a lot dumber.
But in the end, does it matter? They're both big piles of...
Look what you made me do. Look what you made me do. Look what you just made me do.
Number
Look what
3.
you just made me do.
Alright, so I couldn't actually find any clips of this on YouTube, so I'm just going to use this clip from Hannity.
We just want to give everyone the opportunity to speak to somebody about the love of Christ. I mean, they can make their own decisions, and unlike ISIS, this is not a convert or die proposition.
I'm a relative newcomer to this whole religious film craze that's been going on the past few years. Yeah, I reviewed Saving Christmas and eventually did see I'm Not Ashamed, but that's it. But I decided to go see this. It was just me and a bunch of old people in the small theater while everyone else was seeing Thor Ragnarok. This movie basically has 3 modes: offensive, boring, and incredibly ridiculous. It is so anti-Muslim, it literally starts with 9/11 and then transitions into the Boston Marathon bombing. The only time they ever mention religion in a negative light is when referring to ISIS. And as for the atheists, well, Kevin Sorbo is an atheist for the first third of the movie, and he's portrayed as a complete asshole, as is pretty much every other atheist. But once he converts, he becomes the best father in the world. The only atheist who isn't a complete douchebag is revealed later to be a Christian who was keeping it secret.
Guys, you can't badmouth the atheists and just expect them to be on your side just because you bash the Muslims. Or maybe you can.
After Sorbo does convert in a scene with some of the worst green screen I have ever seen in a theatrical movie, it was just so bad, it becomes boring for long stretches. I was slouching so low in my seat that I think no one behind me knew I was there. And as for the ridiculous, well, we have stereotypical Mexican pasture and a gay guy who says darling so many times that if you make a drinking game out of it, you will vomit.
We had to only run a clip that doesn't give the story away.
Oh, don't worry, Sean. It's not possible to give away the story because there's barely any story in it. There's no real structure. Him being the world's most famous atheist is pretty much forgotten by the halfway point. Then it just becomes him trying to rekindle with his family. And then they throw in cancer. And yes, it is as tonally confused as it sounds. But there is one thing that actually makes it a little more bearable. And that is the great chemistry between Kevin Sorbo and his real-life wife Sam. These two actually do give great performances, even though they managed to spawn 3 kids who can't act, but they do make some of the dialogue work. But they can't save it. It's still pretentious, boring, and at times pretty fucking insulting. And that's what pisses me off. It doesn't show love and compassion like a real Christian movie should. It's just bitter and angry.
It's amazing that a parody of these types of movies with pretty much the same plot manages to have a more Christian message than this film.
When my homies pull up on your block, they make that thing go grata-ta-ta.
Look what you made me do. Look what you made me do. Look what you just made me do.
Number 2.
Look what you just made me do.
Hey, it's The Loft 2.0.
Claire, look at you. You look great. It's been too long. It's fabulous. Brother?
Worried about you there, standing that you were gonna make it across the room.
Now we get into the real shit. These other movies were bad, but I couldn't muster up much anger for them. This one pissed me off. It's just an ugly movie, not only because it's uninteresting to look at, but everything about it is just so unlikable. It's one of the most hateable movies I've ever seen. There are no good characters, they all were assholes. I couldn't sympathize with any of them, and maybe that was the point, but even if it was, they can be unlikable and still be watchable, but I found all of them annoying. They just yell at each other for 2 hours about stuff I didn't care about. It's also pretentious with a bunch of pseudo-intellectual bullshit that it says to make it sound smart. The editing is terrible. I swear this thing had more cross dissolves than Norm of the North and I Know Who Killed Me combined. It's horribly directed. This is one of those films that likes to go back and forth between different times, but it's done so shittily that I couldn't tell what was going on. And sometimes they just take 10 minutes to talk about Gettysburg. What does Gettysburg have to do with this story? I don't know. I don't even know what genre this is. I mean, it's listed as a dramatic thriller, which is a lie. It tries to be a drama and fails, but it doesn't even attempt to be thrilling. And apparently it's based on a book, which if that's how the book is structured, then that would make sense. But in a movie, it doesn't work. And apparently the guy who wrote the book hated it. The only 2 things I can say were good: the acting was fine, which is one thing that makes it slightly better than The Loft, and the actual dinner, you know, the food, it looked really good. Sadly, this film doesn't focus much on the dinner because it doesn't really focus on anything. I hated this movie. It was one of those movies where I thought it was almost over, checked the time and saw there was still an hour left and nearly cried. I thought really hard about turning this off, but I wanted to talk about it. I pulled through specifically so I could put it on this list. Yeah, it really wasn't worth it.
And finally, I don't know why this is becoming a trend, but just like The Boy Next Door and 9 Lives, this has one of the most abrupt and
Bitch, I make bloody moves. Look what you made me do. Look what you made me do. Look what you just made
Number
me do.
1.
You just made me do.
My worst movie of the year is 50 Shades Darker.
Why didn't you tell me that?
I did, but you were asleep at the time.
Okay, well, generally, a key part of good communication is that both parties be conscious.
I didn't like the original 50 Shades of Grey, but despite that, I did like several aspects of it. The sex scenes were really good, Dakota Johnson gave a solid performance, it looked great, the soundtrack was good, and it did have an interesting ending. Only one of those has transferred to the sequel. Dakota Johnson is still acting the unholy fuck out of this shitty material, and once again, she's really good. That's it. While the first movie tried to be ambitious with the cinematography, this one, it's shot fine, but there's no atmosphere and the editing is awful. There is no sense of time. I couldn't tell if between scenes 1 hour had passed or 1 week. The sex scenes aren't good this time around, and once again, they're barely in it, but they're mostly slow, not sexy, and have this ugly music blaring over them. Oh, and speaking of music, whereas the first film had Ellie Goulding and The Weeknd on the soundtrack, this has that Zayn and Taylor Swift song and Halsey, which would be great if this wasn't 2017, and unless you have Justin Bieber in your pop song, it's probably going to be slow, boring, and sound depressing, even if it's about love.
Oh god, I hope next year has better pop music.
So most of the good stuff from the first film isn't as good, but everything that was bad in the first movie is even worse. Jamie Dornan, as well as pretty much everyone else, are terrible, the dialogue is a lot dumber, and there's a part where Anastasia gets a promotion for just suggesting they get new talent. The abuse implications are much worse here. There's no plot. At least in the first movie they tried to have a plot. They failed miserably, but here they don't even try. And they don't replace it with the stuff we wanted to see, you know, the sex scenes. They just have the characters talk and do stupid things. And you know, I'll admit, I actually was kind of looking forward to this. Not just because of the ending of the first film, but the trailer actually did make it look interesting. There was a helicopter crash and a crazy ex-girlfriend, and I was like, oh god, that looks insane. Both of those are resolved in a couple minutes. They have no impact on what little story there is. You could have taken them out and changed nothing. They got a new writer for this one, and apparently it's the husband of the book's author, which makes me wonder why they didn't just get E.L. James herself to write it. But this really made me appreciate what Sam Taylor Johnson and Kelly Marshall did with the first film. They tried to make something out of it. Yeah, it didn't work, and in a way they made it more pointless by trying to give it a point. But they tried. They at least attempted to make something. 50 Shades Darker is just fucking garbage. Yes, I'll see the third movie because at this point, why not?
So, that's it for the worst, and I guess I'll end this video by giving a resounding fuck you to everyone who made 2017 suck. And join me tomorrow for the best of the year. Bye.